May 1945, Glicksburg Castle near Flintberg on the Danish border. Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, sat down across a table from a team of American economists and began to explain in detail how Germany had lost. He was not being tried yet. He was being surveyed. The United States had assembled a body called the Strategic Bombing Survey. Over 1,000 people, statisticians, engineers, and economists set into the ruins of Germany to determine what had actually worked. Among the men questioning Speer over those days were economists who would go on to shape American policy for the next 30 years. They had one central question. What broke you? Speer was in a position to answer it better than almost anyone alive. He had run the machine. He knew what had been produced, what had been lost, what had been repaired, and what had never been rebuilt. He talked for days, and the transcripts run to hundreds of pages. He did not name a tank. He did not name an aircraft or a rifle or a ship or a bomb. He talked about oil, about railways, about the moment when production reached its highest point of the entire war and stopped mattering. And over the following years, as American and British officers systematically interviewed hundreds of captured German commanders, the same thing happened again and again. Asked to name the weapon that beat them, professional soldiers who had fought for 6 years named things that could not shoot. They had a word for what had killed them, and it was not the name of any machine. Section 1, the largest confession in military history, 1946. Allenhof and later Königstein in occupied Germany. The United States Army did something after the war that had never been done on this scale. It gathered up the surviving senior officers of the defeated enemy, sat them down, and paid them to write the history of their own defeat. The program was run by the Army's Historical Division, and it produced somewhere in the region of 2,500 manuscripts written by several hundred former German officers over more than a decade. Campaign studies, staff analysis, personal accounts, assessments of Allied methods. It is the single largest body of testimony ever produced by a defeated army about its own destruction. The man who came to supervise much of it was Frenhalter. Until 1942, the chief of the General Staff of the German Army, the professional head of the institution that had planned the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. 6 years named things that could not shoot. They had a word for what had killed them, and it was not the name of any machine. Section 1, the largest confession in military history, 1946. Allenhof and later Königstein in occupied Germany. The United States Army did something after the war that had never been done on this scale. It gathered up the surviving senior officers of the defeated enemy, sat them down, and paid them to write the history of their own defeat. The program was run by the Army's Historical Division, and it produced somewhere in the region of 2,500 manuscripts written by several hundred former German officers over more than a decade. Campaign studies, staff analysis, personal accounts, assessments of Allied methods. It is the single largest body of testimony ever produced by a defeated army about its own destruction. The man who came to supervise much of it was Frenhalter. Until 1942, the chief of the General Staff of the German Army, the professional head of the institution that had planned the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Dismissed by Hitler, later arrested after the July 1944 bomb plot and held in concentration camps, he ended the war a prisoner and spent the following years working for the American Army. In 1961, the United States gave him a Civilian Service Award, and they are remarkably consistent, which is itself a problem we will have to deal with before the end, because a room full of defeated generals all giving the same explanation for their defeat is not automatically telling you the truth, but start with what they said. Section 2. The word they used. There is a German word that appears throughout this material, and if you understand it, you understand the entire German assessment of the United States material schlock. The battle of material, it did not originate in the Second World War. It came out of the first from the Western Front, from Verdun and the Somme, where German soldiers first encountered a kind of warfare in which skill, courage, and tactical brilliance were ground down by the sheer industrial weight of shells and machines arriving from factories hundreds of miles away. It described a battle in which the outcome was determined not by what happened on the field, but by what could be delivered to it. For a German officer, material schlock carried a very specific emotional charge. It was the antithesis of everything the German military tradition prized. The German army had built its self-image around operational art, maneuver, initiative, the decisive stroke, the idea that a smaller and better led force could defeat a larger one through superior skill. That was the whole doctrine. And in 1940, it had worked spectacularly against France. Material schlock was the name for what happens when that stops working. And by 1944, the word is everywhere in German accounts of fighting the Americans. It appears in unit war diaries, in after-action assessments, in the memoirs and manuscripts. Officers used it to describe the artillery, the air attacks, the endless replacement of destroyed equipment, and the general sense of fighting an enemy whose losses cost him nothing. The word matters because of what it concedes. When a German commander wrote that he had lost a material schlock, he was saying that the outcome had been decided somewhere other than the battlefield, in shipyards, on assembly lines, in supply depots, on roads. He was saying that the war had been settled before his men made contact. That is the answer to the question in this video's title, stated in the enemy's own vocabulary, but it needs unpacking because they had more stuff. Is the shallow version of what these officers were actually describing. Section 3. The things they named. Read enough of this material and a pattern emerges in what specifically the Germans singled out. It is a strange list. They named artillery, not the guns themselves, which they considered ordinary, but the speed and weight with which American fire arrived, and the apparently limitless ammunition behind it. They named air power, and again, the emphasis is revealing what features in German accounts is not chiefly the destruction of factories. It is the destruction of movement. Officers describe the impossibility of moving formations in daylight, of running trains, of bringing fuel forward, of concentrating a reserve anywhere near the front without it being seen and attacked. An army that cannot move at will has lost the thing. German doctrine most depended on. They named trucks, and they named them with something like disbelief. American forces were motorized to a degree the Wehrmacht never approached. A German army that had invented the armored breakthrough was still moving the bulk of its infantry and supplies with horses in 1944. They named the fuel and its absence on their own side. They named the supply dumps. Captured German officers driven through Allied rear areas recorded the effect on them repeatedly. Not the weapons, but the parks of vehicles, the stacks of fuel drums, the crated engines and tires and rations sitting in the open, because there was no longer any realistic prospect of German aircraft coming to bomb them. Notice what is absent from that list. No German officer's account concludes that they were defeated by a superior tank because they did not believe they had been. They rated their own armor highly and with justification. Very few concluded they were beaten by superior infantry or superior generalship. The Americans, interestingly, reached almost exactly the same conclusion about themselves from the other side. Eisenhower, writing after the war, listed the 4 pieces of equipment which he said most senior officers had come to regard as among the most vital to Allied success in Africa and Europe. His list was the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2-in-1/2-ton truck, and the C-47 transport aircraft. He then observed that curiously none of them was designed for combat. The winner's assessment and the loser's assessment converged on the same category of object. Section 4, Speer's answer, 12 May 1944. Speer's own answer given to his interrogators in 1945 and repeated for the rest of his life was more precise than any general's because he could see the whole economy rather than one front. He identified a date. In the spring of 1944, the Allied bomber forces, which had spent years attacking cities and factories with mixed results, shifted to a systematic campaign against Germany's synthetic fuel plants and its railways. Char understood immediately what that meant. He is recorded as regarding that shift as the moment the technological war was decided. Not because the factories stopped, but because the fuel did. And here is the part that makes his testimony so damaging to any simple story about weapons. German armaments production did not collapse under the bombing. It peaked under Speer's reorganization. German output of aircraft, tanks, and weapons rose steeply through 1943 and reached its highest levels of the entire war in the middle of 1944, while the heaviest bombing in history was falling on the country. Germany in late 1944 possessed more combat aircraft than at almost any earlier point in the war. It could not fly them. Aviation fuel production had fallen from something like 175,000 tons a month in the spring of 1944 to a few thousand by the autumn. Aircraft sat in dispersal pens and were destroyed on the ground. New pilots reached squadrons with a fraction of the flying hours of the Americans they would face because there was no fuel to train them properly, and were killed at rates that made the problem permanent. This is why America's greatest weapon cannot be a tank or a plane, and Speer is the proof. Germany had the machines. What it did not have was everything required to make machines matter: the fuel to move them, the train crews to operate them, the transport network to deliver them, the spare parts to keep them running, and the ability to replace them when they were lost. The Americans had all of that in surplus. That surplus was the weapon. Section 5. The enemy of the enemy agreed. November 1943 Throne. The Germans were not the only ones who reached this conclusion, and the corroboration from the other direction is worth a moment because it comes from a source with no reason to flatter the United States. At a dinner during the Throne Conference, Joseph Stalin raised a toast. He said the war would have been lost without American production. Coming from Stalin, this was an extraordinary thing to say aloud, and it was not diplomatic politeness. The Soviet Union had received through Lend-Lease hundreds of thousands of American trucks, and the mobility of Soviet offensives from 1943 onward rested substantially on them. Soviet armies advanced across Eastern Europe on American wheels, eating American food, using American radios, moving on American rail equipment. Senior Soviet figures acknowledged this privately with a candor that never appeared in Soviet public history. Kruf, in his memoirs, was explicit about how much the Red Army had depended on American supply. Zhukov, in a conversation he did not know was being recorded, said something similar, that they could not have continued the war without American material. So consider the position. The two great land powers of the war, one fighting America, one fighting alongside it independently, arrived at the same judgment about what the United States actually contributed. Not a decisive weapon, a decisive. The German officers who wrote that they had been beaten by material schlacht, and the Soviet marshals who admitted they had been carried by American trucks, were describing the same phenomenon from opposite sides of it. Section 6. The problem with the testimony. Now the uncomfortable part, and it needs saying, because a story built entirely on what defeated generals said about their defeat has an obvious flaw. They were not neutral witnesses. They had powerful reasons to give exactly this answer. Consider the position of a German general writing a manuscript for the American Army in 1948. He is a professional soldier whose profession has been comprehensively destroyed. He is writing for the people who beat him. Some of his colleagues are on trial, and he is being asked to explain how it happened. We were outproduced is for that man the ideal explanation. It preserves his professional honor completely. It says the German army was not outthought, outfought, or outbuilt. It was simply buried under an avalanche of material that no amount of skill could have overcome. It converts a defeat into a kind of tragedy in which the losing side is the more admirable one. It also does something else. Blaming material and blaming Hitler's interference allowed a generation of German officers to write a version of the war in which the army was a professional institution that fought cleanly and lost to arithmetic, a version which quietly detached the Wehrmacht from the regime it served and from the crimes committed in the East. Historians have spent decades unpicking that account, and Halder's supervision of the American program is part of how it took hold in the English-speaking world. So we have a body of testimony that is enormous, consistent, and produced by witnesses with a clear motive to say precisely what they said, which raises the obvious question: is the material schlacht explanation true, or is it an alibi? There is a way to test it, and it exists because of something the German generals did not know was happening to them. Section 7, the rooms with microphones. 1942 to 1945. Trent Park, a country house north of London. Captured German generals were held there in conditions of some comfort. They had gardens, decent food, conversation, and each other's company. They also had microphones in the walls, the light fittings, and the trees. And every word they said to one another was recorded, transcribed, and filed. Similar operations ran at other houses for officers and men of lower rank. The whole system was one of the better kept secrets of the war, and the transcripts were not declassified until decades afterwards, when historians published them and revealed what German officers said when they believed they were talking